So during the late 15th century and early 16th centuries, you have Spain and France that are more involved with the exploration and colonization of the New World. England is late to the game, and it's partially because some internal troubles, largely to do with religion, that they are going through during that 16th century, during the 1500s. Now, Queen Elizabeth is going to die in 1603, and she will be followed by King James I. And there had been attempts in the 1580s to establish a permanent English colony in North America, but those proved to be a failure. If you remember the tragedy of the Roanoke colony in the 1580s. Now, King James I is a little bit more interested than his predecessors in expanding England's influence outside of Europe and especially in North America. So in 1606, he charters what's known as the Virginia Company. And what's important to know about this is that it was a private company made up of investors. And these were folks that wanted to see a return on their investment. That is, that they were going to send exploration into North America and hopefully make money. Now, they hope to find gold, of course, is the major commodity, but it's also a bit about finding that glory and the power, and then also, of course, converting and spreading Christianity to some extent, not as much as their counterparts will in New England later on. But in 1607, you have the first ships arriving in what will become the permanent settlement of Jamestown. They reached the Chesapeake region of Virginia with 104 men. They left with 105. They lost one, so they're feeling pretty good after crossing the Atlantic, having only lost one man on board. Now, just like today, if you're going to try to sell land, you're going to market this, you're going to try to attract investors. And well before Jamestown, you have these ideas of empire being marketed. And most prominently in England, you have Richard Hakluyt. And he was an English historian in geography. And his writings, although he had never visited North America, his writings sort of set the stage for the attraction that so many Englishmen would have for pursuing these dreams of empire and profit in the New World. And in 1589, he publishes his famous The Principal Navigations, Voyages, and Discoveries of the English Nation. Again, that's within the context of that failed attempt to establish a colony at Roanoke on the outer banks of North Carolina. Now, Hakluyt, he's selling this vision, selling the hopes of folks to easily profit. And so he writes of the Virginia area, of the Chesapeake region, where these ships will arrive in the spring of 1607, that the earth bringeth forth all things in abundance, as in the first creations, without toil and labor. So these are the ideas that are sort of in the heads of these explorers and adventurers as they arrive on the North American coast in April of 1607. Now, the Jamestown settlement, of course, these are not the contemporary at the time boundaries between Virginia and North Carolina, as there were no colonies there. These were lands dominated by Native Americans. And you can see where the lost colony of Roanoke had been in the 1580s. And these three ships carrying 104 men, they will sail up what becomes known as the James River and establish this fortified colony along in the marshy waters coastline of the James River. Now, they did this for defensive purposes. Their enemy, Spain, is in the area, so they want to be sort of inland so that they can protect themselves. Now, this was not going to be the best choice for health, as we see. There'll be immediate problems in Jamestown. One is that you have brackish water, which is a mix of fresh and salt water, and it's a breeding ground for especially mosquito-borne illnesses. And that's going to take a toll on these adventurers. Now, the 104 men who arrived, many of them were gentlemen adventurers. There were laborers to do some of the manual labor as well, but they're hoping to find instant wealth. Again, they've got these ideas of Richard Hakluyt that the earth gives forth in abundance without toil and labor. And they were very soon to find out that that was not going to be the case. There is a general reluctance to work as they first arrive. This is again spring. They need a food source, they need shelter, and they're going to see a very high death rate. By the end of 1607, those 104 men are cut down to just in the 30s. About 38, 39 men are left within just 7 or 8 months. Some of that is because of warfare with the local Native Americans, which are led by Chief Powhatan, which heads one of the strongest confederacies of Native Americans east of the Mississippi River at the time, with some thousands of warriors and about 14,000 people under his umbrella of authority. Now, there'll be a series of Powhatan wars, the first being in 1610, and that's strictly over food. There needs to be a food source, and the natives control those food sources over this small English population. The second one is going to be 12 years later in 1622, and this is a result of more English colonists arriving and moving deeper into Powhatan territory in a search for land, and specifically land on which to grow tobacco. And we'll talk about the tobacco, or the importance of tobacco rather, in just a moment. The Third Powhatan War will be later on in 1644, and this is really going to spell the end of the power of the Powhatan Confederacy in the Chesapeake region. Now, John Smith is perhaps the most famous colonist of the Jamestown colony, and he is going to take control of that colony in the fall of 1607. So he arrives in chains aboard the ship. He had been charged with leading a mutiny on board, and the leader of the voyage that had been appointed by the board of the Virginia Company had placed him in chains. Now, by the fall of 1607, he has shown that he is very adept at negotiating with the local Indians, and he assumes control and immediately puts forth the stricture that he that shall not work shall not eat. So basically, he is taking control and making sure that these small band of colonists will hopefully survive the coming winter. If it's fall of 1607, they're looking forward to a winter, and they need food and they need adequate shelter. Now, Smith is going to actually be injured in a gunpowder explosion in 1608, and he will leave the colony, never to return. And there have been some reinforcements, some new English settlers that are arriving over the course of 1608, to where you have about 400 settlers by 1609, including a couple women. This was a colony that in its early years was dominated by men. They were mostly, the settlers were arriving were young single men. Now, going into the winter of 1609, 1610, becomes what's known as the starving time. This is the time of the first Powhatan War. The Native Americans literally have the colonists, the English colonists, bombarded or kept in their forts, so they can't get out to obtain food or to hunt. And as they go into that winter, again, there's nearly 400 settlers. And 4 or 5 months later, after the siege of their fort by the Powhatans ends, most of them have died. There's only 60 left by the spring of 1610, and they say, hey, we're out of here. During this time, they had resorted to cannibalism, most likely the eating of colonists that had already died. And John Smith's back in England, and he's hearing reports of this, and he jokes that he had never heard of a wife that had been eaten, because one of the corpses that had been cannibalized had been a woman. Now, in the spring of 1610, these 60 colonists decide that hey, we've had enough, we're getting out of here. And they leave and they start sailing down the James River. And as they do, they run into a reinforcement crew, and they order these 60 colonists back to Virginia. And the new governor of the colony, the new director of the colony, declares martial law. Now, luckily, before they left, they had not burned down the fort. So when they returned, some shelter was still there. Now, again, during these first 4 or 5 years of settlement, the colonists are trying to find that commodity that is going to bring wealth to the investors and to the colony itself. and they had not succeeded. One of the men that was on that reinforcement ship in the spring of 1610 was John Rolfe. And John Rolfe had actually been shipwrecked, and he was in Bermuda, where he lost his wife and young child. And he joins this shipment, this crew of English colonists that are going to Jamestown. And he brought with him some tobacco seeds, and he had been working on different hybrid versions of tobacco. And it really takes off when he reaches Jamestown. It's a sweeter, less harsh form of tobacco that is incredibly popular in Europe. And very quickly, it becomes clear that the commodity that this colony is going to rely upon is tobacco. And within just 5 years, an observer noted that the streets and all other spare places are planted with tobacco. The colony dispersed all about planting tobacco. Again, this focus on a commodity, and tobacco really saves the colony itself. Now, John Rolfe is also famous because he is the one that will marry Pocahontas, and who was Powhatan's daughter. It was not John Smith, as the Disney film says. Now, tobacco, despite its profitability, was very labor intensive. So you need laborers, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. It also exhausts the soil, which down the road is going to cause many issues for the Virginia colony. It's also going to lead to the growth of plantations and dispersed settlements. So if you're trying to grow a large labor crop, you need large amounts of land. And so it's going to lead to people moving away from centers of authority, centers of governance, and establishing a more dispersed settlement. Now, it's also, since you need land, you're also going to have to encounter more Native Americans, and that's going to lead to that Second Powhatan War in 1622 that I mentioned, and then also that later Powhatan War of 1644. So the expansion of tobacco and tobacco culture is going to cause increased tensions between the local natives and the English colonists, who are increasing in population and moving westward out of the center of the Jamestown fort and the Jamestown town. Now, this need for labor is also going to mean that you're going to have the introduction of African-based slavery, and the first Africans arrive in Virginia in 1619, the same year that the Virginia colony has its first meeting of its assembly. So you have the arrival of a limited democracy in the Virginia colony at the same time that you have the first enslaved Africans arrive, and they were traded to the colonists by a Dutch warship. Now, it's important to remember that there was no concrete institution of slavery. So while these Africans were considered enslaved, there were no real laws to say exactly what slavery was and what it wasn't, and what the rights of these enslaved people were, if they had any. Now, the other form that was actually the preferred form through a large chunk of the 1600s was indentured servitude. And these were typically white men under the age of 21. And what these indentured servants did was they usually were coming from pretty dire situations, and in some cases from poor families who actually bounded them out to service. So they would receive free passage to America in exchange to a term of labor. And so the ship captain would contract them for this term of labor, and then the ship captain would sell that contract to a landowner in Virginia or elsewhere. Now, at the time, they're not treated that much different than an enslaved African. Again, the laws of slavery had not been developed in the early 1600s. That's going to be a process that takes place in the late 1600s, early 1700s. And, one thing when you're thinking about the establishment of the English colonies in North America to remember is that most people that came here were not free. 2/3 of all English colonists were indentured themselves, and that does not take into account the many thousands of Africans who were enslaved and brought to the colonies themselves. This also serves as a way for the English to bring in or to rid themselves of convicts, of criminals that they don't want in England. So this is sort of a population outlet for them. Now, again, over the course of the 1600s, you're going to see the sort of divergence in how white indentured servants are treated compared to enslaved Africans, and those are going to be gradually encoded into law to where by 1705 you're going to get this system of race-based slavery. They're still indentured servants, but they are treated differently than enslaved Africans. Now, early on in the 1600s, again, most planters are going to prefer white indentured servants, and that that was because, for one, they were cheaper, and two, the life expectancy was so low that no matter if you purchased an enslaved African or a white indentured servant from Europe, they were most likely going to die within a few years anyways. It was early on, not many indentured servants would live through that term of service and receive their freedom and a plot of land or tools of their trade. So, again, the difference between indentured servants and enslaved Africans is still being worked out by the English over the course of the 17th century.